Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Coffee and Open Source, a place where we can learn, chat with some good folks, hear all about the cool open source things that are going on right now, and have a little bit of fun on the way. Today, I'm super excited. My guest is an actual software engineer, which we don't get very often around here. So today, my guest is Matt Bierner. Matt, do you want to say hello?
Hi, I'm Matt Bierner. I work on VS Code currently, mainly focusing on JavaScript and TypeScript support, but then also working on things like web views and all that type of thing.
That's awesome. I want to talk about VS Code because obviously, as everybody knows, like VS Code is a pretty well established and well respected open source platform, open source project. But before we get started in that, I kind of want to talk about kind of how you got started. So, like I mentioned, you're a software engineer on the VS Code team, right? So, how long have you been working on VS Code?
So I've been on VS Code since right around the 1.0 release. So I think that's around 3.5 or 4 years now. I've been at Microsoft for a little over 6 years now, and then kind of moved into the development side, so the developer division at Microsoft, I think 4 or 5 years ago. So I kind of transitioned into the VS Code team right on the original release time. And so there's just a bit of feedback, and it's been really cool to see how the product has grown. So we started out with a pretty small team. The team over in Redmond has grown quite a bit larger. Obviously, our user base has grown quite a bit larger, and the product has really evolved. But I think one of the interesting things is if you look back at the original version of VS Code, a lot of the same core principles are still there. So we still have this focus on like using the command palette, and we haven't really dramatically gone away from that original vision of having like this lightweight editing experience that brings the power of of some IDE type features like bugging and that type of thing, but then also the simplicity of something that's more like a text editor, so Sublime or remember that type of editor instead.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty awesome, right? And like I said, I think VS Code, it's when it was first introduced, I think I was right away, because before that I had used Notepad++ extensively. I didn't even really use Sublime that much, and then I just kind of easily transitioned into using it basically for everything. So one of the things that I always like talking with folks about that join the stream is kind of how they got started in tech and how they kind of got started working with open source things in general, right? So do you remember like the first time maybe you were younger, maybe you were in high school, maybe you were even younger than that, where you kind of came in contact with software and came in contact with things that were, I guess, conceptually open source and liked the idea of free software sharing amongst everybody? Do you remember an example like that?
Yeah. So I think the first programming thing that I remember was in elementary school. There was a book fair that we had, and there was a book about making your own website. And this was like the early web days, so it had like a mouse on it because it's like you're browsing around. So it was this cartoon mouse that was going to help you build your own website. And I think it'd be really funny to actually go back and find that book now and see like how web standards have evolved. So I'm sure it's using like the blink tag and all these terrible things and like font tags in HTML. So it would be entertaining to look at that. I don't remember actually ever building anything successfully with that. I think I built some very basic things. Then we kind of moved in middle school and junior high to using things like Dreamweaver to build websites. And that is where I actually remember creating some things. And in high school, I got involved with Flash as well, just kind of fitting, seeing that Flash is being retired now. So my first language that I really learned was ActionScript. And I remember, I remember like really struggling with some of the concepts. So things like classes and inheritance, and just like not understanding how this worked, and like what is a method, and just really struggling to understand the very basic concepts in retrospect. But I think it's always valuable to kind of be able to go back to that place and understand that, hey, for somebody, this is completely new, and understanding all these abstractions is really challenging when you're first getting started. So that was my introduction to programming. And some of the Flash stuff kind of goes into open source stuff as well. There are all these libraries you pull in for building Flash things. I never really built anything super fancy in Flash. Like I never put together a complete game, but I did put together things for like school projects. So there'd be a project on like, hey, you need to make a presentation on some subject that is really boring to me. So I'd put together a little Flash website or something like that. Not very fancy, but it would have some animations and other things. And I'd find a way to integrate my interest in like programming into these other projects that weren't so interesting. So one I remember was I was in the orchestra, and there was a project that we had to do about like the history of music, and I wasn't super interested in that, so I put together a website that had all these probably like really too many animations going on all over the place, was talking a little bit about the history of various composers and of various instruments as well. And that was sort of an example of how you put these things together. But I do remember using some open source libraries for like tweening and all these other things that were going on. And from the interest in Flash and ActionScript, it sort of gradually moved over into JavaScript instead. And that's really where my original open source interests kind of developed from, and where I actually started putting code out into the open. So I got really into the JavaScript side of things, working on some various libraries there, mostly consuming libraries to start with. So again, finding libraries for things like tweening or animations, or jQuery, of course, was the big thing back then. And then eventually,
let's not forget everybody.
Yes.
Easiest way to manipulate the DOM. Easiest. Anyway, sorry I interrupted.
Yeah. I think I would not want to build a complete website on it. So it's definitely, I really appreciate like the impact it's had, because when you look at the web standards now, you're like, oh, a lot of these actually seem like they were influenced by jQuery, and it still makes a lot of things super easy. So I always laugh whenever you come across a Stack Overflow answer, and it's from like 2009, and it's saying, yeah, just use jQuery is always the answer for everything, pretty much from that time frame. So it was. I was using jQuery, and then I started publishing some of my own little libraries and things that I put together, or things that I thought were interesting. So just like, oh, here's a library for working with, I got into functional programming, so like working with functional streams or that type of thing. So just throwing those out there, not really, initially I wasn't even using NPM, so it was just like, oh, here's the source code for it, putting it on GitHub. And then eventually into actually publishing it and thinking about like, how do you maintain proper versioning, and learning a little bit more about what actually maintaining a library would look like. Of course, nobody was actually consuming them, so you could just bump the versions however you wanted to. So I think on one of my, I was working on a programming language, or a library that was supporting it, and I think I went through like, it got up to like version 17 over the course of like 1 month. so just like because I was like, oh, this is a breaking change, I should bump the version with semantic versioning. So I just kept going up and up in terms of the version numbers. There'd be like one version 15 would be out for like half a day, and then I'd publish version 16. So that was sort of my introduction to the world of publishing things in open source, was these like JavaScript libraries, and it just evolved from there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think so. There's a lot to unpack there. So one, so you and I think have we kind of got started in tech at a very similar time, right? So the first thing that I ever worked on was I built a website honoring like the Shelby Mustang. So like the movie Gone in 60 Seconds had just come out, and that was like a great movie to me. So I was like, yes, I'm gonna make an entire website to this, and so I did that. That was like the first thing I ever did, other than like messing with computers in general. But you mentioned ActionScript, and I thought that's very funny because when I was in college, I was a TA for like a computer science like intro web development class, and one of the labs was basically just that, like use ActionScript. So I basically was like, okay, morph some text from hello to world, right? Like anybody who has done anything in ActionScript knows that's extremely easy, right? But I found it was like the easiest way for me to introduce something like ActionScript. Like you said, like going from like HTML or like really like vanilla JavaScript to ActionScript is pretty I guess you could say overbearing. Like it's very intense, right? So so that was kind of the way that I thought that was good to introduce people to it. I mean, and also you mentioned a couple of things I thought was really cool too. Like, so you kind of got started learning about open source, like using GitHub as a channel, which I think is pretty cool. A lot of the folks that we talked to, they started a little bit before that, like, code magazines in the mail and things like that. But I think it's really awesome because I'm in a similar boat. I learned a lot about open source just through GitHub, and before that, CodePlex. And it's pretty cool to find out that there's, all these new developers that are coming into the industry, like they're learning how to code using GitHub. And I think that's pretty cool. And so one thing also that I think is pretty interesting as well in general is like you were talking about some typical like open source concepts, right? Like you mentioned like semantic versioning, right? Like I still don't know how semantic versioning works. As somebody who I own a handful of open source repositories that like are actually like used. I guess you could say not actually. I mean that sounds pretty not really used, but you know what I mean. And I'll do the same thing where I'll be like, okay, this requires something. I'm gonna bump the version up some obscene number. I'm not up to like 17, but occasionally I'll be like, I wonder if people are concerned that they're going from like version like 3.1 to like 3.8, like so things like that, right? But yeah. So anyway, I think it's really cool. So a couple of things as well. So have you been traditionally a developer in the web space, kind of your entire developer life? Not career, but just in general, right? Like you say, you started with websites, like Web 2.0 days, right? Where it's like use terrible JavaScript. CSS wasn't really like a thing that people like use extensively. So a lot of like font tags, a lot of blink, like you mentioned, blink tags. So have you kind of always been in the web? I know that now like you work on things that are kind of like, I don't know, want to use the term full stack, but like it kind of is full stack.
Somewhat. I mean, I think that's where my focus has mainly been, but I certainly have done, like, I remember trying to learn Objective-C, for example, because we always had Macs growing up. So it's like, they had ActionScript, we could do some very basic things, but then I was like, I want to try Xcode and Objective-C. And I don't remember exactly when this was, but it was sometime when I was pretty new to programming still, and just like the syntax for it, I couldn't do anything in the language. I think I got like a for loop to run, and I was like impressed with, I remember being very impressed with how quickly it could print out numbers compared to Flash. I was like, oh, this is a very powerful language because it can print out my loop of numbers very quickly compared to Flash, which is a lot slower. So that was my first like desktop language, and then I did a lot with like Python around on the server side of things. So Django and like that part of things. So Python programming, I remember working a little bit with Pygame, trying to build some games with that. So it hasn't all been web. And then more recently, I've gotten a little bit back into doing iOS development and just learning modern iOS development with like Swift. I was using React Native, and I still prefer React Native, but it's been interesting learning the Swift side of things and kind of going with the Apple approach for native iOS development.
Yeah. So somebody who's been extensively, it seems to me like you've been kind of using Apple products and using Macs. Like, in general, like, what is your, experience or opinion as being like a traditional developer, right? Because like when people think of developers, they think of like, oh, they have to have like the monster, Windows machine with like 400 gigs of RAM, and like, they have 18 different, IDEs of their choice of running. So like as somebody who uses a Mac extensively, like how has that experience been?
But pretty good. I definitely, so I worked on Office when I first joined Microsoft, and that was definitely a product where it's like the case where each developer had, so we were working on a product, we were on authentication, where you need both the server and the client side of Office. And to build the entire Office suite would take, it was like a day on these super beefy build machines that they have, because there's all these, it's not just like Excel, PowerPoint, there's all these like supporting Office products that get built as well. And each developer on our team would have like 3 or 4 desktops, like physical desktop machines that we would just put in like a big room somewhere and you could connect to. Because builds would take a long time and you wanted to be able to do things in parallel. And this was with the builds even being parallelized. So it was like using all the resources on the machine, but you need 3 or 4 of them so you can switch between them and have like one branch on each of these machines. For like Mac development and iOS development, I think the big barrier is just that you have to have a Mac in the first place if you want to develop for iOS. And now there are some solutions, like I saw Amazon just rolled out where you can like rent a Mac Mini in the cloud and stuff, but that's still a big barrier for people that are wanting to get into that, is just having the hardware. I've never felt constrained by the hardware itself. Like I just had an iBook growing up, which was like their education, pretty low end one. And you could still do basic development on that. It never felt like that was getting in the way and limiting me. I wasn't doing anything fancy though.
Yeah, no, it's I always like to talk to. So, for instance, like I have never really gotten a good familiarity with Mac. Like every time I've ever been given one in a past job, like I use it like once a month. I use it like once a month. So like I still have a hard time navigating just the ecosystem. I'm not saying that I despise or dislike Macs or Apple. I just think that in general, I've been more aligned to Windows just for whatever reason. But like I like talking to people about their experience with Macs because, like you said, like if you're building, I guess I don't want to use the term enterprise, but if you're building like larger scale software, traditionally most people do it on a desktop or whether that be Windows or Linux or whatever. It's not like when I think of Mac, I definitely think of like the laptop. Like I know that Macs build the PCs or the desktop machines, but I don't really ever other than like really hardcore graphic designers or people like that. I don't assume a lot of people use those for development, but I could be wrong. But yeah, I think
on the VS Code team, we do end up using a lot of Macs because it is the easiest way to test cross-platform. Like we can run natively, we can do the Mac side of things, and then with Parallels, we can run Windows and Linux very easily and test everything there. So we do have, it's a mix of developers who are kind of full-time on Windows laptops or full-time on Mac. I think everybody on the team has access to a Mac for testing purposes, but some of them will use the Windows machine as their daily driver. I'd say maybe like half of the team will do that, and then the other half will use the Mac machine as their daily driver, just depending on what they're most comfortable with. And then we do have these Macs for testing because they make it easy to test on these cross-platform.
Yeah. So you do bring up VS Code, right? So I'm curious, like, what is the typical day of somebody who works on VS Code, right? Like, is it just a lot of, and I know that there's lots of developers on VS Code, right? So like, I don't assume that every developer's experience is the same. But like for instance, yours is a lot of like looking at community comments on GitHub, like making sure that things working with the product are good. Is it looking at opportunities to enhance existing products or build new features? Where is the primary of your time spent?
Yeah, so I can talk about two things. One is like the day-to-day stuff, and then one is kind of how we actually go about planning features, and they sort of are related together. So in terms of how we actually go about deciding what we're going to work on, there is a longer-term roadmap of things like here over the next year or so is what we want to deliver. And some of those will be based on what the community has really upvoted. Some of those will be things that we think are important. Like at one point we said, hey, remote development, where you can connect your local development machine up to like a really beefy machine in the cloud. We think that's super important, even though there hasn't necessarily been a community issue that said this is really important. We thought that was a really cool thing and wanted to invest in it. So we have this long-term roadmap, and then we try to break that roadmap up into 1 month chunks so that if there's something really complex like the remote development, that was something that pretty much took a year, but we tried to break up the different parts of it into these 1 month iteration plans where we could deliver different parts of it. And these iteration plans might have features that are going to be delivered, like we might add a new setting or a new command or new functionality that has been requested, but we try to have like definite things that are going to be delivered each month. And then each developer will have certain things on that monthly iteration plan that they're actually tasked with delivering. Now, how you actually go about delivering those is pretty much up to each developer. So the way our iteration plans break down is over the course of the month, we'll either have 2 or 3 development weeks. The first week of the month is always just debt reduction stuff where we're working on cleaning up the code, addressing things that we find are annoying in the code or in our services, like in the build setup or anything like that. So it's kind of open to the developers to go through and address whatever they find is annoying and work on basically technical debt stuff. And then after that, there's 2 or 3 weeks of development time where you're working on the features that are actually listed on the iteration plan. And then finally, once that's done, then we have a week of testing where we actually get the current VS or the next VS Code build ready, and we're going through and testing all the features that have been delivered. Now, during the 2 to 3 weeks of development time, it's really open in terms of how you're going about delivering this. It's not. It's, I think, a lot more open than some other teams that I've been on. So just in terms of, there's not really micromanaging. And I'd also say that what most developers on the team are doing is very similar. So we have like principal software engineers and people who have just started on VS Code, and they might have different levels of responsibility and like different numbers of features that they're working on, but their day-to-day work is actually pretty similar as well. So let's say I'm working on a new feature, and in my case, I work a lot with the TypeScript team. If there's a new TypeScript feature that's coming in, I might work on that maybe off and on during the week, depending on what I'm feeling like and what state things are in. I'll communicate with the TypeScript team, and over the course of a day, I might switch between multiple different features. Typically for me, in the morning, I will handle incoming issues or comments that have happened, and for that, just the scale of the VS Code repository. Like, if you look at the number of incoming issues, we have 100,000 plus issues that have come in, and then you consider that there's comments that are coming in on many of these. And so we get, like, every day there'll be like 2 or 3 new pages of issues that come in. And it's just a completely different scale than I think what people are used to for open source projects. So that's a challenge, managing it on its own. And then you have to consider that we don't have just the VS Code repository, like we have all these other repositories and supporting projects. So in my case, I have like TypeScript comments that will sometimes come in and I need to respond to. So I will use the morning time to go through those and respond, and then use the afternoon to focus and actually work on like a new API or a new feature or fixing a bug or whatever I think is most important or I'm most interested in right then.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of things there that are extremely fascinating, right? Like, one of the things I thought was very interesting is you brought up TypeScript a lot, right? I think it's very safe to say that for a very particular reason, like TypeScript and VS Code, they're very deeply connected, right? Like, I think that's, something that's very, very interesting because, as folks don't know, like, TypeScript is also like a very large open source project in itself, right? So, and you mentioned that there's just thousands of issues that get opened, a week or a month or whatever. And, I'm curious, as somebody that gets overwhelmed occasionally if I, look at a repo or I look at my notifications and I see that there's been like 5 or 6 new issues created in a day, I get kind of overwhelmed. Like, how is it managing because I do understand, as somebody who does look at issues for large projects occasionally, there's a lot of like tech support related questions that get intermingled with, bugs or feature requests or what have you, right? So how do you manage, when new incoming issues come in? Like, how do you triage, whether or not like you should prioritize them or you should just do a quick response saying, hey, this is something that could be better looked at Stack Overflow or somewhere else? Like, what is that process like? Because I imagine that process just in itself, like the triaging of new issues, is time consuming.
Yeah, it's really a skill that you have to learn how to efficiently do it. So you don't want to spend too much time on each issue because then you can't give all the issues the time they deserve. So it's like you have to find the right balance. And I think that is a skill that new people to the VS Code team sort of have to learn. And there is sort of an easing in period where as you start shipping more features, obviously more issues are going to be reported against those features and there's more history for people to report things against. So there's this easing in period where you don't have as many issues that are incoming. Yeah, it's interesting. I think I've moved to trying to just be very efficient in terms of issue tracking. We've developed some bots and other things on the VS Code repo that can help out. So, like, for example, we often see that people file issues against VS Code when it's caused by a language extension, like, let's say, Python or C++. That's super common. And from the user's point of view, you can sort of understand that because it looks like VS Code is causing the problem, but behind the scenes, it's really the extension that's triggering this behavior, and the bug is in the extension land. But from the user point of view, they just consider VS Code a single product in many cases. So we have like a bot command where you can say X Python, and it will quote whenever you say that in a comment or with a special issue label. The bot will come along and have a pre-canned response that will say, hey, this is caused by the Python extension, please file it over there. And that's kind of the reason we do have this bot command instead of just moving things ourselves is we sort of want to teach people that, hey, this is over on Python, and we also don't want to spend all the time doing the issue movement and being involved there.
Yeah, of course. I think that's pretty spot on, right? Like, I think that the automation is very key, right? And I imagine that very, very quickly, it was decided, okay, so we're going to automate as much as this community engagement as we can, right? Because I think you have that's a very accurate statement in my opinion. Like, so for instance, like, as somebody who uses VS Code daily, occasionally I'll run into something that I just don't think is right. And the first thing that I'll do is I'll try to figure out, is this caused by an extension? And I think, to your point, a lot of it is like, okay, I'll get some extension that I think fits a need, but it doesn't quite fit a need. It is an open source thing. And I just assume, like, if it's on the VS Code marketplace, it's just going to work 100% as expected, which isn't true. So I am very cautious of, like, okay, immediately blaming VS Code for everything. But I also understand that some people, to your point, are very much like, VS Code, every extension that's in VS Code should work flawless. But unfortunately, that's not how open source software works. I'm very curious as well about, like you mentioned, for instance, like there are extensions that the team owns. Like you mentioned, like remote work, right? So I use the remote SSH extension literally every day. I have Raspberry Pis all over my house, and I remote SSH into them because it just makes life substantially easier. And I'm curious to know, because like you said, it was a year long of building out that feature. So like, obviously the decision was made, okay, so we want to enable folks to be able to remote into, whether it be machines via, whether it's containers or other machines via SSH or what have you, like we want to have this functionality. And we understand that it's a really big undertaking, right? So what was the thought process about, like you mentioned, breaking things into monthly chunks, right? So how does that work? Because what I think that's a lot of that, and that might be how the sausage gets made a little bit, which I'm interested in, and maybe some people aren't. But I'm curious, like when we're talking about building a huge feature for a huge open source project, like you just can't do this thing where, it's waterfall and like you just drop the feature like completely done in like a year, right? Like you want to iterate, introduce small little pieces to it, right? So how does that thought process work out?
Well, for the remote one specifically, I think a key part was that we're starting from a better place than we could have been. So the core architecture of VS Code made some of the changes easier. And things like having the extension host where all the extensions are running, that is actually run as a separate process, and then just using IPC to communicate with it. If that had not been our model, and we'd been running all of the extensions on the same thread as our UI, and it had extensions that could just go and like update the HTML, it would have been a heck of a lot harder to actually go and have the remote extensions properly work. Because now, how do you have something running on your remote machine go and like manipulate HTML or in the DOM that's on your local machine? So there were some choices that were made early on in terms of VS Code that really made remote development easier. But then that's not to say that like when you suddenly move the process like the extension nodes to be remote, there's like a huge set of assumptions that are suddenly broken in the code base, and you really have to go through the code base and fix a lot of those. So breaking down the problem, we sort of focused on the technical things that needed to be achieved first, and thinking about. So we first had this exploration phase where we're just thinking about like, what would this even look like? And then we started iterating on these various technical problems that we find. And each of those technical problems would typically go into a milestone, or if it was larger, we'd try to break it down further into multiple milestones until we actually had a pretty good product and were confident in releasing it. Towards the end, we moved into more polish phase where we were like, hey, we want to do more testing on this. We need to handle things like reconnect. But early on, it was more about just getting the basic thing working. And it sort of grew in scope to, we originally were just exploring what we could do with Docker. We thought that was pretty cool. And then over time, we sort of expanded it to be this SSH and WSL and containers and all these other things. So as we were working on this problem, we understood the problem space better and saw how we could address it in these different ways. But yeah, we did break it down so that we tried to get like the basic connections working and then more polishing over time. And there are some larger features that didn't work initially that we would then work on over the months to actually support in the remote cases as well.
Yeah, I think, and you mentioned kind of one subtle thing that I think was brilliant as it pertains to building out VS Code, right? So you have your UI thread, like the thing that basically paints the editor, complete like in a separate process than what the services, the extensions, all of the I guess you could say background services running in different threads and different processes in parallel as well. And I think that it probably wasn't thought of when this decision was made. But then when you talk about things like code spaces, right, where from a VS Code perspective, you can connect to a container or a VM in the cloud, completely away from your home network, and it just works, right? And that without that decision being made to kind of offload background services in the UI into different processes, like that would probably not be possible, right? Like I know just from an internal perspective, like Visual Studio, they had to make a lot of changes to support the idea of having the UI in a separate process than everything else, right? So I think that's it was when I found out when I found out about this fact that you could take the UI from VS Code and point it literally like anywhere as long as you get the API signatures correct. It's pretty amazing. So one of the things I think is really interesting as well is that you talk a lot about like the UI, right? And you mentioned the DOM, right? Because most folks know VS Code is built on top of Electron, which is for all simplicity's sake, it's a browser, right? It's like an embedded Chrome browser, right? I'd like to know what your experiences have been kind of building that, because you're building web tools or web applications, but they're clients, right? Which is like an interesting concept in general, right? Because the thought of Electron is, like as a web developer, you can build desktop apps. Like, so what is your general thought about kind of having to worry about desktop things, but you're writing code in TypeScript and JavaScript?
Well, I think the real benefit of Electron is that you can write it once and have the UI look pretty much the same anywhere. So we can be pretty confident that when we're developing on a Mac or when we're developing on Windows, whatever we're developing will pretty much work on these other platforms and look good. I think Electron, when you bring it up, there's sort of this gut reaction that is developed for some people. And I don't fully understand it. I don't know that the people that are like throwing shade on Electron all the time have actually worked with it to understand like here's the benefit, and like many of these apps would not exist if Electron was not here. And that native frameworks certainly aren't without their flaws. Like native frameworks have the same problems, and when you update like a big version, like a major version of a native framework, there's other things that can go wrong certainly. So it really simplifies things for us. There are complications certainly, like bumping Chromium versions sometimes will mess up certain graphics cards, and if we were on a different type of framework, that might not be something we have to worry about the same way. But it simplifies, I think, so many other things for us that it's definitely been worth it. And I like all of the tooling that comes around it. I like the overall development experience. And we haven't found it to be, like most of the performance things that we're dealing with are not related to Electron. It's like, hey, the language server starts up and it's processing like a million files. Like Electron is not the issue in that case. Like the language server that's doing all this other stuff, that is the place where memory usage and CPU usage are going to be high. It's not the little UI thread over there that's doing things.
Yeah, I think so. As somebody who thinks they know why people throw shade at Electron, I think it's because, in general, I think it's probably been 5 years, last 5 years, maybe 6 years or so. For whatever happened, browsers it turned into resource hogs, right? You saw it a long time ago with Firefox, and then a lot of people switched over to Chrome, and then Chrome kind of had a similar issue, and then people switched back over to Firefox, and then Edge has the older version of Edge, and people don't like that. Now it switches to Chromium, and so now you have like these three browsers that, unfortunately, they're not all based on Electron, but they're not all based on Chromium. Sorry, but you run into a situation where you have Chromium, which I don't know if it's Chromium that's the issue, or if it's just the concept of extensions, which I think that's what the real issue is with why browsers are so heavy. People install like 100 extensions into a browser, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, Chrome or Microsoft Edge takes up, like half a gig of RAM. Like, why is that? Or a gig of RAM, why is that? And I would be interested to know, like, if people that complain about it as much as they do, like, how many extensions they have. I think the reason why people are like, oh, Electron is based on Chromium, so it's obviously going to be resource heavy. You see other tools that are built in Electron, Teams, for instance, or Slack, and they do have resource issues. But VS Code really doesn't. Look, I will say, if you have a lot of extensions on VS Code, your experience isn't as good as if you have no extensions. But I'm curious to know, like, how important, I guess, is the public perception of performance in VS Code? Because I don't see a lot of people complaining about the performance of VS Code at all. Like, people complain about Slack and Teams all day, or any other Electron app. But VS Code, I don't really see a ton of, negative comments about how it's slow.
Yeah, and I think that equating Electron with slow performance is just like not correct, because there are native apps that are like really slow. Like it's not like being a native app is fast. And I don't mean to be like mean to Xcode or anything, but it's like if you open a 1 megabyte like JSON file in Xcode, it like freezes the entire app for like multiple seconds, and that's like all native. So it's not like being native is some magic bullet. There are some core design things that I think VS Code did that limit the impact that extensions can have, because there's kind of two different things with performance. One is perceived performance, and then one is like actual performance. And perceived performance is actually the more important one. So if you have an extension that can come along and, let's say, block the UI thread in some way, that is going to be really bad for the perceived performance, where you like click something and nothing happens. And VS Code is intentionally designed where it's running extensions in this separate thread and with this more declarative API where they can't really impact the UI directly. They can just tell VS Code to show UI elements, like show a quick pick, but they can't go and say like, hey, I want this DOM node to be green or something like that. That design, I think, really helps the perceived performance of things. Certainly, if you have a lot of extensions, those extensions can suddenly shoot up the CPU usage if they're doing something crazy, if they have like an infinite for loop that's going on. It's not like magic, but splitting things up that way has been really helpful. And then there's also some surprising things that we found in the course of developing VS Code. So early on, we were thinking about how do we optimize the storage of text data in VS Code. And the natural solution you think is, hey, we need to write this in C++. Like this is the only way to do it. We can really optimize memory usage, and we can optimize CPU usage if we write this data structure in C++. And we actually discovered that, hey, there's a not you can't ignore the overhead of actually communicating between JavaScript and C++. So if you had like an all C++ app, maybe it would be the fastest way to do things. But for our case, where you're presenting all of this information in the DOM, it actually was faster, and we could get pretty great performance just by optimizing the JavaScript. There's a lot of work that goes into it, but it's not like it's a huge amount of extra work compared to optimizing something that's written in C++. It's like you could write something very efficient or inefficient in C++ too, and then have to spend time optimizing it. So we just had to test and actually measure the performance instead of going with like, oh, my gut feel is that it should be this way, and we're going to commit to that. And it was a cool discovery to say, hey, we could actually write this in JavaScript and get pretty great performance out of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty spot on. I think the idea of having the UI thread really never be blocked. I mean, I don't know that's 100% true with VS Code, but like, it always seems like VS Code reacts to mouse or keyboard clicks very, very quickly, regardless of what's going on. You can look at like the output window for anything, and that's like a million things are going on always. But it seems like the UI is very responsive, which I do think, to your point, like perceived performance. Even if the click's a button and like you're literally just moving one thing or whatever, people, when they click a button or when they type a keystroke, they want immediate reaction by a piece of software.
Yep.
If there's any delay, there's like, oh, this is not good software.
Yeah, and like really, we do like stupid things for that too. Like instead of triggering a click on the click event, for example, where you have to have like mouse down and mouse up, we will trigger some things on just mouse down, and that just makes the app feel faster. And it's like that's not a very hard thing to implement, but it makes the perceived performance a lot better. And because we're always like we use VS Code to develop VS Code, we're very sensitive to that type of things. So if VS Code is slow for some reason, we will notice that and say, hey, we need to fix that because it's making us feel bad using the product to develop VS Code.
I mean, I wouldn't feel that bad about it, right? I think like a lot of software does silly things to make the user experience as good as it could be. I do think that there is a general love of VS Code, like, again, and maybe it's just I'm not in the right echo chambers, but I definitely don't see a lot of negative comments about VS Code in general. Like, sure, some things probably aren't as ideal for some folks, but in my scope of what I work on, like VS Code works pretty good. And if it's something that isn't working, it's usually an extension, right? An extension isn't doing something that I want. But yeah, I think in general, I think that VS Code does a really, really interesting job of kind of being it. I know that the goal is to call it an editor. I know that a lot of folks have called it an IDE, and people will be like, no, it's not an IDE, it's an editor. But I see it as comparable as, Visual Studio or Eclipse or, Xcode or whatever, right? it's responsible for a kind of a different set of principles. I think one of the things also that's very interesting to me about your experience when you're talking about like just working on VS Code is, the amount of effort that it probably takes to even add new features, right? Like when we're talking about adding new features, like you mentioned that communities will upvote things or they'll ask for things, and then you do this simple triage of trying to figure out, okay, so what's from a business perspective, like what features are going to bring more people to VS Code, because that's at the end of the day what the goal is, right? So can you think of one particular feature that had insane amounts of community, like give us this, give us this, give us this, and after doing a ton of looking into it, you're like, it doesn't bring enough, it just doesn't bring enough users to VS Code to justify the amount of work we require to introduce that feature. Can you think of one?
I'm sure there's good examples, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. I think some features are interesting because we had a really popular feature for pinned tabs, where people really want to be able to pin a tab. And to be honest, the way that many of us work on the VS Code team, it's not using the tab bar at all. We'll keep the tab bar enabled, but we'll use quick open to navigate between things. And if you look at how people work on the VS Code team, that is typically how we get between files. So this is always a feature that's very popular for a certain set of users that are coming from, I think Visual Studio had this feature, and it got thousands of upvotes and stuff. And we eventually implemented it because we thought, yeah, this is popular enough that we want to implement it, even though it's not reflected on the VS Code team itself. So it's interesting when you run into problems like that. Another example is folding. I never fold the code. I just jump between different sections. But folding is super important to a lot of users and very core to how they're actually looking at files. And you have to kind of weigh what your personal preferences are and set those aside sometimes and think about what is the community saying in those cases. And that's not to say if a feature or something that we think is really fundamentally against VS Code's core vision comes in and it gets thousands of upvotes. Let's say somebody wants to be able to access the editor DOM. We think, yeah, even though that would be super powerful and super cool as an extension to be able to rewrite VS Code and do whatever you want, that goes against our core principles and would have blocked things like remote and code spaces, all these other cool things we've enabled. So we're not going to just always go with community upvotes on that, but we do have to weigh what they're saying and listen to what the core message is. And there might be a core thing that they're asking for that we can enable that's not the whole editor DOM access. There might be some smaller nugget in there that's that's really what they're asking for. It's not. There's sort of a solution that was already proposed, but there's other solutions and other ways that we could have solved this with the core problem they're trying to address is.
Yeah, I think, and I think one of the things still is very interesting, right? I think a lot of people in general, when they get introduced to new software, and they have existing software that does something, like you mentioned Visual Studio, right? So people that go from Visual Studio to Visual Studio Code, they're okay, well, these are the things that I love about Visual Studio. I need those things in VS Code to be able to do my job or be able to enjoy VS Code, right? So people are very much add this particular feature from this other product that has no affiliation with Visual Studio Code to Visual Studio Code because it'll make my life better. So I see that a lot, not just with Visual Studio Code, but also I see it in Visual Studio, right? Visual Studio Code will introduce something, and I'll a couple months later, I'll see, looks like Visual Studio did something very similar. I wonder if it was because they saw Visual Studio Code add something and there was a general interest from the community in adding that. You also mentioned something that I think is very interesting in general, right? Knowing the fact that Visual Studio Code is an open source project. It's, most if not all of the work is done completely on GitHub in the open. Yet, there are people that think that VS Code has too much Microsoft stuff in it, right? So there's a fork of VS Code where all the Microsoft telemetry collecting and all of the stuff gets taken out of it, right? And I'm curious to know, what's your thoughts in general about that, right? So, an existing product is forked, even though it's completely open source, it's forked, and then kind of all of the, I don't want to say, organizational connection is taken out of it. Similar to Chromium in Chrome, but in the reverse, right? So, like, what is your general thought about, the fact that the community saw, oh, like, we love VS Code, but we don't want all this other Microsoft stuff? Like, what is your general thought about that?
Well, I think it's sort of, there's a good reason why people, I think, are concerned about telemetry, but there's also, I feel like, so the first thing is that, like, forking VS Code, that is entirely, like, you can go on GitHub and fork it, and we have, like, the MIT license and everything, so you're free to go build your own version of VS Code. You can't call it, like, Microsoft VS Code. You'd have to call it something else if you have your own release, but that's all, like, perfectly fine to do. So for, like, telemetry stuff, it's sort of, I feel like it has some of the same aspects of the Electron discussion, where there's just this knee-jerk reaction by a lot of people that say telemetry bad, and without actually understanding, like, why telemetry can be useful. Like, we're not using it to, like, sell stuff to you. We're using it to be like, hey, this feature is getting used, or it's not getting used. How do we improve that? Or here's all the crashes we're seeing. And I wonder how many people are actually understanding, like, how valuable telemetry actually is to improving the product, because it is something that we use all the time internally to improve the product. That's why we add it. We're not just adding telemetry for fun and, like, collecting data for fun. It's always to improve what we're doing with VS Code. And a perfect example is, like, we have telemetry for when you trigger a refactoring in TypeScript. And we think refactorings are really valuable but underused. So we're trying to look at those numbers and be like, hey, we added this new feature. Did we see an increase in the number of people that were seeing refactorings? And what the type of refactorings they were doing, if they're always doing a specific kind, that's the kind we should focus on making sure it has the best experience. So I wish people talked more about it in that type of thing, and or talk more about telemetry from that perspective, and, like, here's the value that it's offering. You are free to opt out of it, but understand that there are consequences for the developers then to not knowing how you're actually using the product.
Yeah.
For forks, I think it's, like I said, it's perfectly fine to fork things. We do hope that if somebody forks things and is, like, putting out an official product, especially if it's, like, a larger company, they would also contribute back to VS Code in the original case. That's nice to have the, like, core code base being contributed back to. But yeah, they're fine to do that.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that a large organization that sells books should make their own version of VS Code.
Yes.
No.
I mean, legally they can. They could come along. They couldn't call it VS Code, but legally with the current licensing scheme, anybody could come along and make a fork. Really, in terms of what Microsoft is concerned about, it is not you forking VS Code. It is the large book selling organizations coming along and suddenly having a cloud version of VS Code. That is who we are focused on, and it's not individuals.
Yeah, no, of course, and I think that's fair. I do think that there's a lot of interesting things too about. I think in general, people, they love open source, but they love open source kind of on their terms, if that makes sense, right? Like you mentioned the fact that, like, telemetry is very, very valuable, right? Like, most major pieces of software that exist, they collect telemetry. Like, it's the only way really for you to basically justify return on investment, right? You spend a year building a remote SSH and remote WSL and remote containers extensions, and unless you're able to collect telemetry other than just downloads of the extension, which you can track, the usage of the extension is extremely valuable, especially it's like, okay, do we need to make this experience, change it in a different way so people have a better experience using it, right? Like, it's all about trying to greater the end user experience. It's not, like you said, about collecting data, right? Because if it was found out that VS Code was collecting people's data, like, and selling it, that would be not a very, very good experience. So I think at the end of the day, it's pretty interesting, for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, so we're running towards the end of it, and I want to thank you, Matt, for coming on and chatting with us about VS Code. One of the things I think how I came across you initially is that you have these awesome tips that you post on Twitter, right? VS Code tips, which I think are super awesome. And I think I even reached out to you a while ago, and you said that you have, like, a playlist on YouTube where you kind of call them all out, which I'll be sure that people see. So what made you decide that, there's a lot of things about VS Code that people probably don't know, Like, what what is your mindset? What's your thought process around when you create those tips? What you can do to add to them?
Well, I think it's always humbling to see user studies is one thing. So there are official user studies we'll do at Microsoft where we'll bring somebody in, have them task them with a specific task, and then watch and see how they accomplish it. And it's very depressing when you see 80% of people didn't even know the command palette existed, or things like that. So obviously there's a lot of knowledge in VS Code that I think could be shared more widely. And there's also a lot of there's a lot of depth to VS Code that is not immediately apparent. So when you first open VS Code, we've tried to make it clear that it can work with all these other languages, and there's plugins enabled. We have this welcome screen and everything. But if you just get started with a basic text editor, you might think, oh, this is really basic. I don't see the value of this. But there's a lot of depth to the product and a lot of configuration, a lot of these more complex things. And I wanted to create a set of tips that would have both things for beginners who are just getting started, but then also touch on some of that depth and really go and might be things that more advanced users are not even aware of. So for the year, I kind of decided I'm going to do a tip a day, which is a very easy thing to decide back in January 1st, because you're like, oh, that doesn't seem so bad. I can put together a little minute-long video every day for a year. But as you realize that there are actually 365, or in this case, 356 days in a year, becomes a little bit more challenging. So I just had a playlist, and the way I structured it is I tried to spread out the tips that I came up with throughout the year, so I wouldn't have all the really good ones at the start, or all the really basic ones at the start. I kind of spread it out and then made sure that I was filling it in as I went along. And we're almost to the end of the year now. I'm going to probably stop with the daily tips because that can be a little overwhelming, but I'm definitely going to still be posting some other tips. And now I've built up this good library of 366 videos that you can go back and look if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about VS Code.
And I think it's super awesome. I have a general question as somebody who builds content a fair amount. Do you ever forget how to do something and then you Google search it, and then one of the first links is your tip? Has that ever come across to you?
No, that or Stack Overflow answers you answered. You're reading it, you're like, this seems familiar.
Oh, that's my name. Yeah. Oh, that's really sad. So it's definitely awesome. I think that a lot of people, if they go down this path of building things or working on things, and you notice you have to do something over and over and over again, you're always forgetting. Like if you create content around, you blog, you tweet, you create a YouTube video, absolutely worst case, you will find your own content when you're searching for it in the future. So you're doing your future self a favor, because I'm very forgetful when it comes to things. I jokingly say that I forget the Lambda syntax for all JavaScript things, how to create for each, or how to create what dot map, the difference between dot map and dot this, or dot map or dot find or whatever. I always forget the difference, so I literally just the second that I type in the word JavaScript, there's 5 autocompletes of things that I've searched for a million times.
Yeah.
It's always funny because you would think that if you ask the same question over and over and over again, eventually you would remember it. But I guess it's not important enough for my brain to remember, so I always have to search for it. So
it's just a search away.
So. Exactly. I think also that's probably the problem too. I think, and this is just completely separate, I think that the internet has made people more forgetful because you don't have to remember anything because everything's always there. But that's a whole different conversation. So, again, Matt, I want to thank you so much for coming on the stream, and it was nice to hear you talk about, not just how you got started in tech, but also the stuff that you're doing with VS Code and what the thought process is around kind of, I don't know if VS Code is the biggest, but it's definitely one of the most visited GitHub repositories out there, right? I think that, the team has done a really great job of not just bringing new features, but also fixing existing features and making sure that the end user experience is as great as possible. So I want to thank you and the team for that. And how we sign off on the stream is I like to ask my guests if they can think of kind of open source or the open source community in one word, what would that word be?
A tough one.
Yeah, it's hard to put you on the spot. It doesn't have to be one word; it could be a phrase as well.
I think growth, maybe, or expanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's been cool to, I think, going back to our conversation, to see how the community has evolved and how, when I got started, Microsoft was very much not an open source, and then to see how much that has changed over the years.
Yeah, no, I think growth is a great way to describe, because when I got started with open source, I can just see this small amount of time of when I first was introduced to it to now. Like, I think as a developer, you have to be aware of what's going on in the open source world to kind of really get an understanding of what technologies are being used and what tools are being used to accomplish those things. So that's a great way. So again, Matt, I want to thank you so much for coming on. For folks that want to follow Matt, it's Matt Bierner at Twitter. And also he has a YouTube playlist. I'll be sure to the folks see that. So again, thank you, Matt, for your time. And everybody, thanks for coming to Coffee and Open Source. Enjoy the rest of your day.